All right. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're at in the world. Happy to see you all here. We're going to go ahead and get started here because we have a jam-packed session here of all kinds of Azure goodness. And excited to share it with you. So first off, my name is Andy Syrewicze with Altaro Software, and you're here to, learn about how to supercharge your infrastructure with Azure IaaS. And I am joined by a good buddy of mine, Thomas Maurer. How's it going, Thomas?
Hey Andy, I'm fine. How are you?
Good, good, good. So appreciate you being here today, and looking forward to hearing your insights and having you teach us some things with Azure IaaS. So looking forward to it. So let's get started right away here, because like I said, we got a jam-packed session today. I want to make sure we have enough time to get through it all, and we have enough time to leave some room for Q&A at the end as well. So first off, what's our agenda for this session? We're going to do some basic introductions of myself, Thomas, Altaro Software, the sponsor, and then we're going to get into those 5 use cases. So if you looked at the sign-up page for this webinar, you saw that we listed 3 use cases to begin with, and we left 2 spots open for community submitted use cases. We wanted to know what you wanted to hear about, right? So the 3 that we came up with initially were, how to do highly available VMs in Azure. We're going to be talking about that. How to host websites inside of Azure VMs. Creative uses for nested virtualization in Azure. I tend to get a lot of questions about that, kind of things like, hey, what would I use this for? What wouldn't I use it for? And things like that. So we'll be covering that. We're going to talk about how to migrate an on-premises VM to Azure. So Thomas is going to walk us through that. And we'll also be talking about Azure Files and shared storage for IaaS VMs as well. And then we'll do our wrap up and Q&A at the end. So quick thing on the Q&A, we'll try to address questions as we go through here if we have time, but with as much material as we have, we'll probably hold most of the questions towards the end. And we always do like a follow-up blog post after the webinar that includes a recording of the webinar, includes a link to download the slide deck, and it also has a full list of the Q&A and the associated answers. So if you ask a question that doesn't get answered today, definitely be on the lookout for an answer to your question in the follow-up blog post later on. Now, again, some introductions here. Again, my name is Andy Syrewicze. I'm a technical evangelist with Altaro Software. I've been in the industry for a while now. I'm a Microsoft MVP. I'm a VMware V expert. My focus is historically been on the Windows Server stack, VMware, with an emphasis on Hyper-V and vSphere technologies, but more recently, the last couple of years, like I think a lot of people's careers have kind of followed this path of moving into the cloud. And another area that really interests me is containerization technologies. So I've been doing a lot in those 2 areas here the last couple of years. If you want to hit me up on Twitter, I'm quite active on Twitter. My handle is right there. And I'm also very active on all of Altaro's blogs, altaro.com/hyper-v/VMware and /MSP-dojo respectively. And Thomas, I'll hand it over to you for your introduction.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, my name is Thomas Maurer. Probably some of you know me from previous webinars with Andy. I was a MVP and in the virtualization space, and then in the Azure and Azure Stack space. I think a week ago, or like 1.5 weeks ago, I joined Microsoft in the Azure Engineering Team as a cloud advocate. And our focus basically is to, first of all, talk about the great stuff which is happening in Azure and helping customers to make better use of Azure, as well as getting feedback and going to their engineering teams and telling them, look, this is not working. That's a blocker for our customers. What do we need to fix? So that's what I'm looking forward to do, and we'll see how that goes.
Sounds good. Thanks, Thomas. Quick word about the sponsor today, Altaro Software. So we're a fast-growing developer of easy-to-use, fantastic backup software designed for end users and MSPs. That virtual backup solution is trusted by 40,000 plus customers and 9,000 plus partners worldwide, along with 1,000 plus MSPs. And that product is Altaro VM Backup. If you want a little bit more information, you can go to altaro.com/VM-backup for more information. Or if you're interested in our MSP program, altaro.com/MSP for more information on that specifically. And with that, I want to start with a quick poll before we get to our content. So I kind of want to see where you are in your cloud journey. Can we go ahead and put the poll up? and we'll take a look. So go ahead and we'll give you 30, 40 seconds to put your responses in here. Basically, Thomas and I, we kind of want to get a gauge of where you're at, whether you've used Azure a little bit, maybe not at all, maybe you use it a lot. Kind of want to get a sense of where you're at as we start stepping through the content here. So we'll give about a 30 seconds or so on that, and we'll go ahead and display the results here momentarily. And then as we get through the content here, you'll notice that we'll talk about some basic things, but we'll get into some more complex items too. We're going to start by talking about high availability in Azure, which it can be a fairly large topic to cover. So I think we are set with the poll there. Let's go ahead and view the results. Okay. All right, so this is pretty much what I expected. So we've got 33% that said I've only tried Azure experimentally. 29% I've used it for some tasks. We got 8% that use it daily for the majority of their work. So that's higher than I expected. And we've got 18% that are complete Azure newbies, which that's fine too. Okay, so good deal, good to know. So I think with that, Thomas, we'll try to keep things a little bit more on the 101, 201 side of things as we kind of step through the content today. So perfect. Thanks for your responses, everyone. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Thomas, and he's going to talk about highly available VMs in Azure. So I'm going to go ahead and make you a presenter, sir.
Perfect. So I'm going to show my screen and let me know if the screen is up.
Yep, looks good.
Perfect. So our first use case Andy and I came up with was basically high availability in Azure virtual machines. And it is very important, an important part to understand what's possible and how can we design. First of all, I quickly give a little bit of an intro why this is important, but I don't want to spend much time. I think most of you in this call, in this webinar are familiar with the problems we have availability, right? Today, it's not just enough to run the virtual machine and run the service. It needs to be available. The impact can be huge if services are not available. Think about your company and what that means if certain services would not be available for a period of time. This can have an impact on business. It can impact as a brand. And obviously, it can also have an impact in careers. I really don't hope that it has too much of an impact at careers because mistakes happen and failure happens. But if you do bad design, at some point in time, you need to go out and say, okay, look, we did a bad design, and that's bad. So I really highly encourage you to look at it. So I have these numbers here a little bit. What are the causes for outages? And so 56% are basically system failures. Then we have power failures, natural disasters, and cyber attacks, which can take like the outages. And I think that's very important to know that these things happen, even if you have systems, and I've seen systems running with an uptime for multiple years without patching. Don't do that. But there are multiple things which are running for years, but there are failures, right? There are a lot of moving parts. There's hardware which can fail. There's software involved which can be failing. So make sure that we have the right design. And other than designing things on premise, which usually costs a lot of money, Azure offers you certain availability options. And that's where we go in right now. But the most important thing, I think, if you do something on Azure and on every service you design for failure, especially when you go to the cloud, things will go wrong, things will fail. That's a very important thing to understand. So that's why we do that design and why we basically design for failure, right? Just be sure that you take that in consideration. So Azure gives us multiple high availability and disaster recovery and backup options, and I'm going to mix that all up a little bit just to say basically not just have high availability, but availability options in general. So the first one is like if you have a single instance VM, as we call it. If you run a single instance VM that runs in on Azure Premium Storage, you get an SLA from 99.9%. This is basically running in one of the Azure compute and storage clusters, and it's pretty good if you run a single instance VM. However, as I mentioned, hardware can fail, right? And if you're running your virtual machine on a Hyper-V server or in an Azure compute node or wherever, hardware can fail. In that moment, the VM needs to fail over, and that gives you downtime. So we have multiple options to basically work on that. And I know that not every workload can deal with that. We have a lot of legacy applications which basically cannot be clustered or like put in front of a load balancer. I know that. But whenever you can, you should take advantage of that. So the first option we have to get an extra 0.05% of an SLA is called availability sets. And availability sets are nothing else than putting two or multiple virtual machines inside an availability set. And Azure will make sure that they are not placed within the same rack or the same hardware, right? So if one node fails or one rack fails, the other VM will stay up, right? So if you have, for example, two domain controllers or two SQL servers in a cluster, you want to make sure you put them in availability set to do so. The other option, which was announced, I think, back at Ignite last year, is availability zones. So I will talk a little bit more about Azure regions in a couple of minutes, but basically what an Azure region is not just one big data center. An Azure region is a group of data centers, and there you can have different zones with different power and sources and different facilities. So if one building basically goes down or goes offline, then the other buildings stay up, right? And with availability zones, you can put virtual machines, but also not just virtual machines, also other services in different availability zones. So if one building is affected by something, the other things stay up and the other VMs stay up. So that's a very good thing to design with our availability zones. And then the last part I want to add, is for disaster recovery purpose. Azure has this concept of region, and a region is always placed within a specific geographic location, and there are region pairs. So what Azure always does, for example, if you look at Europe, you have West Europe, you have North Europe, those are a region pair. You have, for example, Germany and Germany, like Germany 1, Germany 2, if you will. So data basically, in this pair, you can replicate services from one region to the other. And in case of a failover, if a complete region should go down, like let's say North Europe, which is Dublin, would go down, all your services would go, or the services which you designed to fail over to the second region, which would be West Europe, which is in Amsterdam, would fail over to that region. And you can use services like site recovery, or if you have geo-redundant storage solutions, you can basically fail over those services. For VMs, site recovery is the way to go for that scenario. Good, so let's talk about regions. So Azure has today, I think I just checked the page again, 54 regions all over the world. And usually what you do, you pick your region that are closest to you or where you have your data compliance or regulations in place. So data will never leave a region you put it in, right? As you can see, I talked a little bit about the Europe part, but there we have your regions all over the place which are coming there. So I like graphic views of that. So a region usually is a set of data centers in one location, and then you can have a second region which basically could be in the same country in some scenarios, like for example in Australia and other things like that, where you have your failover region, right? But in some cases the distances are too high, so you need something which is low latency, and then we have availability zones which are basically designed for low latency failures of low latency access of VMs, and are designed to, if a facility fails, in one place, in one region. And then this is very important. I want to add that, again, I mentioned that multiple times. So a region is always a region pair, and there is always this data residence topic I don't want my data I stored, for example, in the US to be replicated to Singapore or other scenarios, right? So it makes a lot of sense that Microsoft is focusing on having those region pairs in certain geographics available. So if services or data is replicated, it does not fall under a specific other rule set. So for example, in Switzerland, we don't just get one Azure data center, we get now two regions. So data stays, it doesn't matter which region I deploy, data always stays within Switzerland. Okay, so this was basically the thing, what do we have to offer? And if you look at the create VM option, this is like from the GUI in Azure, you can basically choose in availability. You can select, you can see in the middle of the screen, you have availability options, and you can choose if you want to place the VM in availability zone or in availability set, which I just described. If you choose availability zone, you can always choose between three. That's everywhere where availability zones are available. You can choose between three zones, right? There are more zones available, obviously, but for you as a customer, you always get three zones available, and this makes sure that the VMs in the same availability zone or placed in zone 1 are in different building than the VMs placed in availability zone 2 or 3. You can check that using, for example, PowerShell. You can see which VM SKUs are available in different zones. And then basically say, okay, place my domain controller in zone 1 and my second domain controller in zone 2, for example. The other thing, if you choose to pick availability sets, this is where you can create an availability set and say, okay, how many fault domains and how many update domains I'm going to create. You can pick up to 3 fault domains currently, and then you have also choose of update domains. So an update domain, a fault domain or an update domain are a group of systems, like for example, a rack in the fault domains case, which can go down. So you want to make sure that you place the servers over different racks or different fault domains as well. Good, and then the last one I want to talk about is disaster recovery. I mentioned Azure Site Recovery. Azure Site Recovery allows you to replicate the virtual machine from one region to another region in case of a complete region failure. And then you can basically go and start your failover plan and automatically failover all your workloads to a new region. This is one thing you can do. However, what you can also do, and what Azure Site Recovery comes from, for those who already knew about it, Azure Site Recovery was enabled to have on-premise workloads replicated to Azure, right? So it doesn't matter if you have a VMware, Hyper-V, or physical servers. You basically can replicate those to Azure and use those as a failover site for Azure. So if you still want to run your service on-premise, but to have a secondary site, it would be too expensive. You can use it to basically replicate to Azure, and you pay a certain fee per machine you replicate a month. You don't pay the virtual machine until you start it or until you fail over. So that's a very good thing. And by the way, Azure Site Recovery for the first 30 days, it's free. So we see a lot of customers, and it's also a recommended way to basically migrate VMs to Azure. So with that, I want to give it back to Andy. We'll talk about hosting websites in Azure VMs.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Hey, one thing about the high availability with Azure VMs, Thomas. You know, I found, at least in my personal experience, I've always been one of those engineers that learns best by doing. You know, so I would highly encourage anyone who's looking at availability sets and availability zones in Azure to go out and actually just tinker with it, just try it out. Are there any resources available that you know of or that you would recommend to kind of help get them down that path?
Yeah, so absolutely. I would definitely go and check out the Microsoft Docs, as well as we have this new thing called Microsoft Learn, which gives you basically guidance and learning paths for different scenarios. And there's definitely also ones for infrastructure as a service. So definitely go to microsoft.com/learn. This is a great place to learn about those scenarios. And not just IaaS, of course, but it covers a lot of that.
Ah, sounds good. Appreciate it. Appreciate it. So just checking, you should be able to see my screen now, Thomas.
Let me see. Looks good.
All right, perfect. Just double checking before I move on. All right, so talking about hosting websites in Azure VMs. You know, a lot of the folks that I talk to about them getting started with Azure, or what are the first workloads that they're moving into Azure, websites is often one of the low-hanging pieces of fruit, right? So I definitely want to talk about that today. And so basically, I just have one slide on this that kind of talks about, you know, what the prerequisites and why you would choose this method over using like Azure hosted web apps, which is more of a PaaS option. And then what I'll do is I'll actually cut over to my Azure portal and actually kind of show you a little bit of what this looks like on the Azure backend. So first off, you know, hosting web services in an Azure VM, it really doesn't require a whole lot. It's actually fairly simple. You just need a virtual machine running in Azure that's set up as a web server. You also need to have port 80 and port 443, you know, whichever one you're going to use, enabled on the network security group for the VM, and I'll show you that here in a second. You have to have a public IP address associated with the virtual machine in Azure, and then you have to have defined DNS settings. And there's a couple of different ways you can do it. You know, you can use Azure DNS, or you can use your own DNS provider. I'll kind of show you where that type of stuff is here in just a second. Now, the main question I always get with, you know, websites in Azure is, why would I choose one method over the other? And I've seen people use both this option, running IaaS or Apache or whatever web server they want inside of a virtual machine. I've also seen people use, you know, Azure Web Apps. Azure Web Apps is a PaaS service that, you know, Microsoft handles the web server component for you. You don't have to worry about things like patching the underlying operating system. You don't have to worry about, you know, managing availability and all of that type of stuff. With the web server. Microsoft takes care of that for you, which then, you know, begs the question, why would I choose, you know, doing a website in an Azure VM over web apps? And there's a number of different reasons, and the big one is, you know, maybe you need finer control over the underlying web server. You know, you want to do things like manage your own patch cycles. You want to make sure that you're installing your own zero-day vulnerability patches on a regular basis, or as they come out. You know, maybe you have integrations with other applications that require back-end access. Maybe there's regulatory reasons that, you know, require that you have access to the full operating system underneath the web server. Maybe you're just not comfortable with PaaS, you know, and that's completely fine. Not everybody is comfortable with a PaaS model. Not everybody wants to use a PaaS model. So if you want to go more the traditional VM route, this is completely fine and completely accepted as well. So with that, I want to go ahead and let's do a demo here. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to hop over to my Azure portal. And if you've seen the Azure portal before, this might look a little bit different. You're going to see some stuff kind of blurred out. I'm using a fantastic Firefox extension here called Azure Mask, which kind of masks the sensitive bits and pieces of information in the Azure portal. It's great for doing demos and you know, screen recordings, or, you know, if you're trying to teach your colleagues something, it's great for that type of thing without, you know, giving up the sensitive information inside of your Azure instance. So from there, I've created a resource group for all my labs associated with this particular webinar, and the one we're talking about today is our web server. So like I said, there's a couple of things that are required for hosting a website inside of an Azure VM. So you see here, I've got a virtual machine here, you know, just -www for web server. If I drill down into that, you can see I've got a virtual machine here. It's a standard DS1 version 2. It's not a very beefy VM, but, you know, enough for what I need here. And there's a number of different components here. So you can see I actually have a public IP address associated with this virtual machine. And as part of the VM, the building process, you're given the option to have a public IP address. And if I drill down into this IP address, I can see things like, okay, do I want this IP address to be dynamic? Do I want it to be static? If it's a production website, maybe you want it to be static. The other thing I've seen people do is you can assign a DNS name label to the virtual machine, and you can see that it's got this name I defined, and it puts, .northcentralus.cloudapp.azure.com at the end. I have seen people leave this setup as a dynamic address and just create a CNAME entry in their domain that points to this DNS name label. So that's definitely an option as well. A couple of different options there. The other thing I wanted to point out was inside the network security group for this virtual machine. So you come in here, and basically this is the firewall for the VM. That's the best way I can describe it. And you can see here that I've got HTTP, I've got HTTPS open, I've got RDP open. Basically any port that I need for external users to gain access to the services that I'm hosting on this particular VM. So that's about it as far as the VM setup goes. Most of this was taken care of as part of the VM building wizard. The only thing that was not was setting up the DNS name label. Now I'm actually RDP'd into this web server, and so you'll see that if I do a get Windows feature web, you can see that I've got IaaS installed. It's just a very basic IaaS instance, nothing fancy. And that, let me double check that the service is running. Get service, I think it's W3SVC if I remember right. Yep. So the service is up and running. And if I go back to my Azure portal and I go back to the web server VM, I can come out here and I can get the DNS name and copy that to the clipboard. If I come back down to my web browser and paste that in, you can see I've got the base IaaS website up and running. So, at this point, you could configure your website however you want. You could attach it to a SQL backend that's running on a VM inside of the same virtual network inside of Azure. A lot of different options here as far as hosting up web services. So, like I said, very basic example here, but kind of gives you an idea of what it looks like to do it inside of a VM. Anything you wanna add, Thomas? Anything I missed?
No, absolutely not. I think you're on track.
Sounds good. Sounds good. All right, let me back to the slide deck here. Now let's talk about nested virtualization in Azure and some creative uses for nested virtualization. So I always explain nested virtualization as like the movie Inception. And if you've not seen the movie Inception, basically it's about dream inside of a dream inside of a dream type of thing. So you could kind of picture nested virtualization as that. So I've got my hardware and I'm running Hyper-V on it, but then I want to create a virtual machine that also has Hyper-V on it, and then run VMs on that. So, it's like VM inside of a VM inside of a VM type of approach here, right? And this feature was really introduced back in Windows Server 2016, and it's since been brought to Microsoft Azure for a number of different workloads. So the big question I always get here is why do I care? Why would I want to do this? Why would I run nested virtualization in Azure? And there's a number of different reasons here. So there are a lot of organizations that have applications that require access to the hypervisor layer. And if you want to utilize those services inside of Azure, you don't have access to the root hypervisor layer inside of Azure for obvious reasons. So if you want to utilize those types of services, and I'll pick on Altaro, I'll pick on us as an example, you need to have access to the hypervisor layer. Running a nested instance of Hyper-V inside of Azure would allow you access to the hypervisor layer and all of the associated services and features that are part of that. Another couple of reasons here, maybe you need resource segmentation under one billable VM. So prior to working for Altaro, I worked for a service provider for about 10 years. And one of the things that we used in Azure occasionally was we'd have a company organization come to us that had multiple departments within their company. And instead of managing all of these different virtual machines, maybe they wanted just one large VM with Hyper-V nested on it, and then they carved it up themselves from there. It just kind of keeps billing simple. I mean, yeah, you could go ahead and run different size VMs, but if you want just kind of a simple billing model, one VM to worry about, it worked in that situation. Now, of course, you have to worry about other things like availability for that VM, and there are a number of different things that you had to take into account. But for their particular needs, it was a valid use case. Another thing here, and one of the reasons that Microsoft developed nested virtualization was containers. So if you're familiar with containers in the Windows platform, there's two modes for containers. There's Windows containers, which is, essentially kernel mode virtualization. It carves off a dedicated run space, but shares the kernel of the underlying host. But in a cloud environment, obviously, you need more isolation than that, and that's where Hyper-V containers come in. That's where they run a container inside of essentially a Hyper-V VM to provide additional isolation. And that's one of the use cases here for nested virtualization in Azure. If you want to build a container host inside of Azure and not use the PaaS services that Azure has for containers, that's a use case here as well. And the other great thing that I really like about nested virtualization in Azure is, a lot of organizations struggle to find training resources. And by resources in this sense, I mean physical hardware, right? A lot of places don't have recent hardware lying around that they can spin up in a lab and test out Hyper-V features and things like that. The nice thing here is that you can spin up a virtual machine in Azure, and it's relatively cost effective for a couple of days to run the VM and do your testing and kind of get used to things, and then just blow the VM away when you're done. And it's a great use case for that. So to get this working, it's fairly simple. First thing you got to do is you have to use a DV3 or EV3 sized VM in Azure. That was the first series of Azure VMs that supported nested virtualization. When you go through the build VM wizard, you'll see a number of different instances of those types of VMs in the list with different allocated resources associated with them. Once you're inside the VM, you can use Server Manager and do install Hyper-V if you want, or you can just issue a PowerShell command, install Windows feature, Hyper-V. So I've got the command there. And then you also have to manage the networking fabric on the VM itself. So how do you get those nested virtual machines to talk out through the Hyper-V VM out to the Azure networking fabric? What you have to do is you have to set up a NATed virtual switch. An internal vSwitch has to be configured for that. And out on the docs page, they have just a quick couple of one-liners that you run in PowerShell that takes care of it for you. There's also a link to a GitHub script that does it all for you, but it's just a 3-liner if I remember correctly, and it's fairly simple to do. So with that, we're going to hop over to another demo here. So if I go back to the Azure portal, and I go back up to my resource group, excuse me, and I go to my virtual machine. So this is my nested hypervisor. You can see here that I've got a D2S V3, 2 vCPUs, 8 gigs of memory. So this is the smallest size virtual machine that supports nested virtualization, and fairly easy to set up. So not a whole lot for me to show you here. But if I go into the VM itself, so I'm actually RDP'd into the VM. And just to show you there's no smoke and mirrors here, I do host name, you can see it's HV1, so the same virtual machine I just showed you in the Azure portal. I've already got a virtual machine running here. You see Hyper-V Manager. I've actually spun up a Debian-based virtual machine. And it's probably pretty small, but I at least want to show you that this thing can talk to the internet. So I've got that internal vSwitch set up. So if I go to this virtual switch manager, you see I created this internal NAT switch, and the virtual machine is attached to it. So what I did is I just installed a text-based web browser called eLinks. And we'll just use it to navigate out to Google. And we say, okay, here's Google. And just to show you that it's working, if I just do nested virtualization in Azure. And there's our Google search. And hey, look what I found. That looks familiar. Awesome. You're ranking on those keywords, my friend. Anyway, So you see that works. The other thing I wanted to show, and what I talked about earlier, was talking about products and services that require access to the hypervisor layer. So like I said, I'm going to pick on us a little bit. So Altaro VM Backup, we're a virtualization backup application. And what I've got here is I've got our product installed, and I've got this virtualized Hyper-V host in Azure added to the product. Now, I utilize an Azure storage account for my offsite backups. And let's say, my on-premise location was hit by a meteor, zombie apocalypse, whatever, right? It's a smoking crater in the ground. I could come in here and I could say, hey, I need to restore a VM. I've already added that Azure storage account. And what it'll do is, because the backups are associated with a different instance of our product, I have to say, hey, click here to scan for unconfigured VMs. So to look at that location for virtual machine backups are contained inside of there. And this usually just takes a minute or two, and it'll give me a list of virtual machines inside of that location. So you can see here, I've got a number of different ones here. And I'm not going to step through this whole wizard just for the sake of time, but I want to show you that once we get to this step, we can show where do we want to restore to. So here it's looking for the backups for this VM in that particular storage account. I can see here, restore to host, HV1. So I can restore to this nested hypervisor, and then using that network fabric that we set up, give it access to the public internets. The other thing you could do is you could do like a site-to-site VPN with a recovery location, and give them more direct access to the virtual machines, and the end users could work. And it really presents a lot of interesting recovery options and use cases there. So with that, in the sake of time, we'll head back over to the slide deck, and Thomas is going to take us through virtual machine migration and Azure Files too, if I remember correctly. So Thomas, let me make you presenter.
Thank you very much, Andy.
Yep.
Let's switch back to my slides. So this is the first one we got from you, the community, which is about one of the use cases we got submitted, which is about how do I migrate my on-premise VMs to Azure, right? And this is super interesting because we get that question a lot. We do a lot of like, how do I basically move my VMs to Azure? So first of all, what I want to mention, it is very important that not just moving VMs to Azure solves all your problems, right? Think about, for example, is there another service? Can I use another service like web apps or other technologies to leverage, like for microservices, serverless computing, Azure SQL as hosted databases? Does that work for me? And does that not solve the issue as well? So I don't even need to migrate to a VM in Azure. This will definitely bring cost and complexity down. However, there are a lot of scenarios where that just doesn't work, right? If you have those legacy applications, or if you have even like newer applications which would need a complete re-architecture to run on PaaS services, then business maybe does not give you the money to re-architect that. So there are certain migration scenarios, and there are a lot of third-party solutions which help you with that. However, Microsoft also has a solution, or we also have a solution called Azure Migrate and Azure together with Azure Site Recovery. So Azure Migrate is basically a service which does an assessment of your environment. So what you do basically, and I apologize for the graphic, but later on in the recording you can see, but I explain what's going on. So first of all, you create a new project, my new migration project. You download a assessment VM, which you put in, or a collector VM, which you put inside your environment, and then you connect that to your vCenter server. Because your vCenter server, if you run VMware, basically has all the information and all the things you need. And so it will start collecting that information, and we'll see, okay, look, that's the VM sizes I have, that's the storage they use, that's the performance they use. This is very important. I mean, if you were thinking about what storage do I need, how many IOPS does my VM cost, things like that, that's what this collector VM does catch, sends that to Azure, to the Azure Migrate service, and there it basically generates reports for you. So it tells you, okay, look, these are the VMs you can basically just migrate to Azure without doing anything, which are compatible with Azure, and gives you an estimate of the size you need, like which Azure VM size do I need, which storage do I need, and it also does a cost estimation for that VM. Then it also tells you, okay, those VMs, they are not compatible with Azure. Like this can be different scenarios. It can be operating systems which are not supported on Azure. However, that's very difficult because there are a lot of different operating systems supported. Or if there is a configuration which just doesn't match, right? If you don't have let's say if there is something, you have a, yeah, it's hard to find with something which is not compatible with it. But if you have something like a 2003 VM, for example, it will tell you this is not supported in Azure, right? If you have that Azure migration report, you basically can calculate the cost. You can tell the business, okay, look, that's basically what it costs. That's how we can optimize. And then to do the actual migration, we have Azure Site Recovery. As I mentioned, it's used to basically build a failover site in Azure, but it can also be used as a migration option. So again, I told you it's free for the first 30 days. So if you do a migration project and you replicate all the virtual machines, you start to replicate those, it replicates up to Azure, you have it up and running. You can even do a test failover, which then basically allows you to test the VM, like see if everything is working. And then at one point in time, you say, okay, now I want to do the failover. What happens then is basically it shuts down the VM on premise. It does replicate all the changes, the latest changes to Azure, and then starts up the VM in Azure, which is pretty good. Then you don't lose any data. You have a little bit of downtime, obviously, until the VM shuts down, replication, the changes are replicated, and then the VM starts up, right? However, to do a migration, and that's a pretty good thing. So again, free for you to use for the first 30 days for which your VM is replicated. So if you do a migration project and you replicate your VMs, it's a pretty good option. And it's available again for VMware, Hyper-V, and also physical servers, or servers running in competitor clouds, for example. If you want to migrate over from another cloud vendor, or also just using DR from another cloud vendor, you can use that option as well. And this comes pretty handy, by the way, since we are soon at the end of extended support for Windows Server 2008 and Server 2008 R2, a lot of customers are running some issues here. So basically what you have two options to deal with those servers. First of all, obviously you should go and upgrade them to a new operating system. But that's not the real world. A lot of companies just don't have the resources to upgrade their applications, which are badly documented, which do not support newer releases. So I understand that in some cases you need to do that. So what you can do, you can stay on premise and you can buy 3 years of extended security updates and then start planning your migration to, for example, Windows Server 2019 or like to Azure PaaS services. If you migrate your workloads, like your 2008 or 2008 R2 workloads to Azure, they will get 3 years of extended security updates for free. So instead of buying that, and if you know the pricing of that, you know that's quite not quite cheap to buy extended security support. You will get that for free if you run it on Azure or even on Azure Stack, since Azure Stack is part of Azure as well. And then obviously, just don't just think, okay, now I have 3 more years and the problem will be gone. Really start planning the upgrade to newer versions of Windows Server, especially Windows Server 2019. Good. So the next one we had also from the community was Azure Files and shared storage for IaaS VMs. So Azure Files basically is a file service, so you can use SMB file shares as a service, if you will. And there are certain things you need to do. So first of all, it was designed basically if you have 2 VMs and they should access the same data set. You can use Azure Files and mount a file share to those VMs, and basically both VMs or multiple VMs can access those files. And we have some more stuff now, which enables new scenarios as well. But let me quickly show you how that works. So I'm moving quickly in the demo here. I just want to show you really, really quickly how that looks like. If that opens, perfect. So I'm here in the Azure portal. I already created a storage account, and with that storage account, you can do blob storage, you can do table storage, you can do a ton of other things as well. And you also have file service here. So with file service, you get those file shares, and you can quickly go and create a new file share. So let's say that's Tom's file share. Let's call it 2, just in case. And then we can set a quota. Okay, that's like 5 gigs in size. I create that file share. It takes a couple of seconds to do so. And if I hit refresh, after a while, it should show up. Let me see. Sometimes it's a bit slow here. I don't usually it creates it super fast, but just let me quickly do that.
Did you make the requisite sacrifices to the demo gods this morning?
I did not, but I think I see the problem here. I'm using Internet Explorer in my VM here, so that's probably not such a good idea. So again, you can see now I have my file share here, and what I can do here, I can give different access policies and things like that, but you can also see that I don't have any files here. I could now use the portal to upload files or create directories. What I can also do is obviously connect it. And you can see it helps. You give the drive letter or something like that. So I can just select something. Let's do T for Thomas. And then if you have Windows, you get the commands. If you have Linux, you get the commands for Linux, and you get it for macOS. However, this is not something really like new, right? It's still, you can use NetUse, for example, to mount that file share. It just makes it easier for you to not like explaining all those commands. Really, it just mounts a file share. So I copy the PowerShell one. And here I have my server. You can see that I only have the OS drive and the temporary storage drive. And if I open up PowerShell, I just run those commands. And what that does is basically mounts that file share to my VM. I don't have to care about any file server or anything at all. I just use a file share as a service. I create a folder on that file share. And for example, if I then go back in the portal, and if the refresh button this time works, which it doesn't, obviously, I just refresh the whole portal in Internet Explorer. You can see now I have that folder. There's nothing in there, but I could now upload using files and things like that. So this is a pretty cool thing if you do that for applications, but also for other things you want to share and have shared access to it. You can even mount those file shares, by the way, locally. However, to make sure that your ISP doesn't block that system. So we also announced a couple of enhancements to Azure Files. So if you look at it, it was quite limited with standard with those file shares. So we had like 1,000 IOPS per share, and we also were, for example, which was very heavily with the file share was limited to maximum of 5 terabyte. At Ignite, it was announced that the standard file share performance goes up to 10,000 IOPS and up to 100 terabyte of storage, and as well. What also was announced was premium file storage, which is a SSD backend used storage with up to 100,000 IOPS, right? So you get a huge amount of performance now out of it when you need it and when you need it. And especially the shared size, the size of the shares are very important, especially for the next feature I'm just going to show you. Based on Azure Files, we introduced a new feature called Azure File Sync. And Azure File Sync is nothing else than a tool to basically replace your file servers on-prem, or to have your files servers on-prem and sync them up to the cloud to an Azure file share, right? That's why this limitation of 5 terabyte was so painful, because there are a lot of file shares which were larger than 5 terabytes. So what you basically do, you install an agent and say, okay, replicate to that file share, and it replicates up to your services. So in case of a disaster, you can do that. So the first thing, what it does is cloud tiering, right? So if you have a storage account back there or a server on premise with like 10 terabytes of storage, but you need to actually store 20 terabyte of storage, you can enable cloud tiering, and cloud tiering will take care of that files which were not touched for a while are basically replicated to the cloud. And if someone accesses it, it gets downloaded back to the server and it gets accessed from the cloud. The other thing is cloud access. So whenever, for example, a server would go down, you can still access the file as I just showed in the cloud using a web frontend or mapping that file share to your servers or systems or workstations. And then what you also get, which is super fancy, is multi-site sync. So if you have multiple locations, in this case, New York and Seattle, you can make sure that you have the same files at the same time available in both locations, right? And they are replicated using Azure FileSync to Azure and from there back to the other location. So this is super handy if you want to make that available and if you have multiple places around the world where you want to make a file share available. The next thing is you can do backup. You can do backup of those Azure file shares just to make sure that if someone deletes something, you can basically back up the file share in the cloud. And then, which is super awesome, is the DR capabilities. So let's say, okay, your server on-premise in Seattle dies, and now you need to restore something. First of all, users could access the file share in the cloud. However, like a lot of scenarios do not allow that. So what you can do is basically set up a new server, server-free, install the agent, point it to that file share. It will start replicating the metadata and will show you all the files and will slowly download all the files in the background. However, people can already access the files again on that system and it will download the specific file directly. So all the people who need to access to a specific file, they will start working again and can work as before, right? So pretty cool feature if you think about those file servers and file systems in the cloud. This is a pretty cool feature, I think, we have here. So with that, I want to give it back to Andy for the QA and wrap up.
All right, let me go ahead and grab the screen one more time. Excuse me. All right, so wrap up and Q&A. So for I always have to swap this around every time. All right. So I'm going to cover a couple of different things here, a couple additional resources that are available to viewers while you get a chance to get your final questions added in, and then we'll leave a few minutes here for the Q&A at the end. So first thing I want to bring to your attention is we have new forums available here at Altaro. It's called our Dojo forums. Currently, we have our Hyper-V forums live, and soon we'll be adding VMware and MSP focused forums. Excuse me, just on the tail end of a cold here. If you're interested in taking a look at that, you can go to dojoforums.altaro.com for more information. Yeah, these two guys look familiar. So if you're interested in hearing more from Thomas and I, we're going to be back for some more Azure focused discussions on a to be determined social media platform. So we're thinking doing some sort of live type of video stream where the topic discussions will be how-to focused and followers can ask questions live on the air. So be sure to take a look at that. We're going to be sending out news on when that'll be available out on our Hyper-V blog. So if you want to get a notification for when that's available, you can go to altaro.com/hyper-v/sign-up to be notified for that. Real quick thing about Altaro VM backup. Again, kind of give you another minute or two to get your final questions in. So again, I mentioned Altaro VM backup earlier. This is our flagship product, and it's designed to really provide backup services for end users and MSPs. We really focus on a number of different things here. One, efficient, easy to use backups. But while they're easy to use, we also want you to have full control and give you access to those advanced features that you're looking for in a backup application. Our support team, I have nothing but good things to say about our support staff. We don't do tiered support here at Altaro. When you pick up the phone and call us, you get a call response quickly, and the person that answers the phone is the person that owns your issue start to finish. Some of our latest developments here in the last year and a half, as you saw in my demo earlier, we can back up directly to Azure storage accounts. We also have continuous data protection now with 5-minute RTOs, WAN optimized replication and DR, and also support for Windows Server 2019. Again, for more information on that, you go to altaro.com/vm-backup for more info. And if you're an MSP, we do have an MSP program. Basically gives you access to all the bells and whistles of the application. You can manage and monitor backups for all your customers from a single pane of glass through a web tool that we have called the Cloud Management Console. It's a pay per VM per month model, so very easy to get into, and there's no contracts. So we don't lock you in for any long-term contracts. We just require a 10 VM per month minimum to get started. You can scale that up to thousands. And then new, we also support Office 365 email. That's a new product that we've recently launched. And if you are interested in more information about that, altaro.com/office-365 for more information. Now, from that, our final Q&A. I've made it a point here for 2019, kind of something of a New Year's resolution, that my dog has to be featured in every slide deck I use. So that's my dog Lucy there on the right-hand side. So I felt like this slide needed a little something extra when I was putting it together. So with that, I want to start with one final poll. So as you know, we handled 2 community submitted use cases today as part of our webinar. Now we got many more than 2, and so really what I want to do is we're going to go ahead and put up a poll here, and we can go ahead and put that up. And basically what this is going to be is we are going to talk about the top 3 choices here on our Dojo forums. So we'll talk about the use cases. We'll get you the answer to the questions and really facilitate community discussion about those use cases. So we want to get your input on what use cases you think you'd like to see and talk about, and we'll give another 20 seconds or so here for those responses while we go through the questions. So Thomas, just looking through the questions here, there was one I saw earlier I wanted to touch on about Azure Stack. And I know you're a big Azure Stack guy.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and the question was, when you were talking about regions, an Azure Stack is essentially seen as an Azure region, correct?
Yeah, kind of, yes. So Azure Stack, there's a little bit more to it. So what people are new to Azure have to understand, there's not just one Azure cloud. There are actually 3 or 4. I cannot count the numbers right now. But for example, think about the Azure cloud as the public cloud we know from West US, Europe, West Europe, North Europe, all the clouds we know. But there are also some other clouds like Azure China, which is a completely separated cloud, which has its own regions. And then we have, for example, Azure Government for the government part. And if you think about it, Azure Stack is basically kind of like one of those. It's not directly connected or part of the Azure cloud. You can connect it to that, but in terms of the methodology, it's basically a separated cloud with its own regions in there. So it does not show up in the Azure portal, like where you see all the regions and then you see your Azure Stack or something like that. That's not how it works. However, you can build those multi-region scenarios with Azure Stack. You can deploy some workloads in Azure region and others one on Azure Stack, and they can be connected. That definitely works.
Gotcha. So from a thought process, you can almost view it as it's an extension of Azure, correct?
Yep, exactly. So what Azure Stack really is it's an extension of Azure services to your location. I used to say to your data center, but with all of the cruise ship scenarios and cars, it's not just data centers. It can be anywhere, right? It can be under your desk here. Yeah.
Right. All right, sounds good. I did see a question earlier as well about load balancing for web servers. So when you go through the VM build process, you will see an option in there for load balancers. So Azure does have its own load balancing services. don't have enough time in the time we have left to handle the scope of that question. But definitely go ahead and out on the Azure website, you'll be able to see all the different load balancing options they have as part of that. And I'll be sure to include a link to that in the follow-up Q&A, the blog post as well. Let's see. Got a question here. Go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, so I saw one which is, I think, very important when I was talking about Azure File Sync. There were a couple of questions. Does Azure File Sync completely replace file servers, or also for small businesses and things like that? So Azure File Sync, basically, you still will have an on-premise file server, right? But it's synced to the cloud, and it will help you with tiering and disaster recovery and so on, but you still will have that. If you're a small business, or if you like try to move a little bit something else, there's obviously also SharePoint and OneDrive for Business, I think, which is a very good solution in Office 365 to store basically your files and contents. I see Azure File Sync there where you have multi-site scenarios where SharePoint is not an option for some reason, like where you don't have probably not just have documents and things like that, where you really need a file share. I think that's where it goes. But if you're a small business and you're looking for a file server replacement, I think my personal opinion on that is really have a look at Office 365 and SharePoint.
Right, right. You know, Azure Files really reminds me of DFS. It feels like DFS for the cloud age. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, kind of like DFSR to just for the ones where you like to.
Yeah.
But trust me, it's better.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if someone in the audience likes DFSR,
Yep.
but this is like I compare it now with like OneDrive for servers, kind of like.
Right.
I'm to be honest, I'm not sure. I haven't investigated if it uses even the same engine and backend than OneDrive Sync does.
Right.
It might, I don't know, but basically how the work scenario, how it works kind of like OneDrive.
Right, right. Well, good deal. So I think that wraps it up for us on time. I wanted to share the poll results really quick before we sign off. And yeah, so this one doesn't surprise me. So the top response that we got for use case was Active Directory hosted in Azure IaaS versus Azure AD. So we'll be sure to talk about that in the forums. The number 2 option was the 100% cloud virtual office. So if you have a small business that wants to run virtualized desktops in the cloud and maybe a couple servers, what does that look like? Is it possible? And then the third one was hosting SQL in Azure IaaS versus hosted SQL in Azure PaaS. So that'll be an interesting one to talk about as well. So yeah, we'll be getting those up as discussion threads on the forums in the coming week or two here. So be on the lookout for that. Again, that's dojoforums.altaro.com. And with that, Thomas, I want to say thanks for coming out and spending the time to talk to us today about Azure. Appreciate you taking the time, my friend.
Well, thank you, Andy, for having me. It's always fun to talk with you. It's always, I think, a good hour spent very well.
Sure is. It sure is. So I really appreciate it. And we're always happy to have you. So, well, with that, I'll let everybody get back to their day. Enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your week. And I'll just leave you with a couple of last minute resources here for more information, various URLs here. So feel free to check them all out. And with that, hope to see you for another Altaro sponsored webinar in the future. Thanks for watching.